Next up, we have a panel for you, and I'd like to invite Carolyn and Jeanine to come and join me on the stage. So first up, I'd like to introduce Carolyn Bennett. Carolyn opened the UK's first conveyor belt sushi restaurant called Moshi Moshi in 1994 in London's Liverpool Street Station. I've been there, it's fantastic. And it's just celebrated its 32nd birthday, which is incredible. Its opening was inspired by Carolyn's time living in Japan in the finance industry, and it was while trying to source bluefin tuna for the restaurant in the late 90s that she learned how endangered the species was and the lack of traceability in the supply chain for it. Carolyn's got a very long-standing commitment to ethics, sustainability and seafood provenance, and it continues even today. She ensures that the fish she sources is from small-scale fishermen on British shores, and is continually campaigning for marine and environmental protection. She's the trustee of Open Seas, which is a charity seeking to ban inshore trawling. And last year, Carolyn was listed in the Independent's Climate 100 list, so congratulations for that one. We also have Jeanine Blachère, who's the Director of Sustainability at the Relais and Châteaux. For those of you who are unfamiliar with them, Relais and Châteaux is a collection of 580 unique and independently operated hotels and restaurants that began in France in 1954, and it's now present in 65 countries around the world. And they share a mission of preserving local cultures and traditions, protecting biodiversity, and supporting people and communities. And since joining in March 2024, Jeanine has worked with head office teams and the Relais and Châteaux members to adopt 12 commitments to sustainability, completed its first global carbon footprint assessment, and launched a number of tools to enable individuals and collective progress on biodiversity, climate, and social welfare. So a lot of work in a couple of years. So, are you ready?
Are you ready?
I'm going to kick off with a question to Carolyn. What operational change most improved fairness for fishers and quality for your customers?
Okay, can you hear me on this?
Yeah.
Lovely. Yeah, so I'm talking, I mean, you've mentioned Moshi Moshi, the restaurant. I'm mostly talking about Soul of Discretion, which was a fishmonger that I've established, but if there are questions on the restaurant, I'm more than happy to speak to those. So the operational changes. So the Soul of Discretion is a fishmonger that is a community interest company owned by the small-scale fishers that land to us. So we work exclusively with the under 10-metre sector, which is the definition by the UK government of small scale. So I think the biggest operational change for us was finding a platform for differentiating to people wanting to eat fish, industrial trawl caught fish from small-scale, low-impact caught fish. So the low-impact caught fish discard very little. They do very little damage to the bottom of the marine environment, to the seabed. They use far less fuel per kilo of fish caught than the industrial. And for the most part, they're skipper operated, right? So the fishermen that we buy from, they'll land and they'll have spent half their money in the pub before they even get home. So the social benefits, the coastal community economic side of things is greatly enhanced. So the operational difference, I suppose, was providing a point for consumers, and I hate using the word consumers, I've managed to do it, for us people, to differentiate industrial from small scale, and essentially to be able to trace back to the boat to be able to do that, and that's the platform that Soul of Discretion works from.
Great, thank you very much. And that theme of connecting values with purchasing does actually bridge very nicely into Relais and Château's SOS for Biodiversity campaign. Can you tell us a bit more about that campaign and how it began?
Yeah, sure. Testing the mic, I think it's working too, great. So I think what's really lovely about that story is, for me, more the process than the outcome itself. We created a short film at Relais to tell you that story that I'm really, really proud to be able to share with you today. So let's just take a quick look.
The wild stocks of eel all over the world are collapsing. They are red listed.
We signed the pledge and we decided to stop serving eel.
La prise de conscience a été très très importante.
Hay que hacer un SOS, tenemos que ser conscientes y defender la biodiversidad.
Il est possible demain d'arrêter de travailler avec un produit, pouvoir se renouveler, pouvoir le préserver pour rebondir sur autre chose.
Sauvons la biodiversité.
Great, thank you. So 83% of the properties you work with have removed eel from their menus. Can you just tell us a little bit about that journey and what's the next step?
Sure. So really what happened behind the scenes was less about imposing a rule and more about creating the right conditions for chefs to be able to make an informed decision. We worked very closely with Ethic Ocean, which is an NGO that we've partnered with since 2009, to be able to really explain the severe threat that the European eel is facing. And then we started at the World Culinary Summit in 2023, where at the call to action of Mauro Colagreco that you saw in the film, who is the Vice President Chefs of Relais and Châteaux, the World Culinary Council members voted to join Ethic Ocean's Eel No Thank You campaign, lobbying the 27 European ministers to address all of the issues behind the European eel's decline, including a ban on fishing. And then when the chefs really understood what was at stake, a lot of them chose to act. So it was whether by removing eel from their menus or pledging not to serve it until the stocks recovered. So the 83% that you see in the film, in fact, out of that 83%, we've got 33% of Relais and Châteaux members who actively removed eel from their menus, which already signaled a huge change in the food space, because Relais and Châteaux has 800 of the top restaurants around the world in its network. So I think the strength of that campaign was showing that it was collective, it was voluntary, and it was really embedded in shared values. And one of the examples that you see on the film is David Toutain, who's a World Culinary Council member and who has a 2 Michelin star restaurant in Paris. And one of his signature dishes was eel, and he replaced eel with herring. So he maintained the same presentation, but of course the sustainability impact shifted considerably. In terms of what's happening next, we are setting for ourselves an objective of 100% eel-free menus at Relais and Châteaux restaurants this year. And to be honest, we know that that's going to be a challenge. Eel is still really heavily embedded in the cultural heritage of a number of countries like Spain, the UK, the Netherlands, Japan, for example. So we're going to keep providing guidance, sharing best practices, sharing the latest information, and of course engaging in some really tough conversations, because eel for us is more than just one species. This campaign for us is really about demonstrating a far greater issue, which is global biodiversity loss. So in that same vein, we are now going to lobby the European ministers in November for a 3rd time, hoping that we will get a better result, and of course reaffirming the fact that sustainability is a long-term commitment.
Great, thank you. Caroline, how do you win over diners with maybe underloved species that have better sustainability credentials, or maybe involving seasonality, and maintain your margins?
Maintaining the margin is always the hard part, isn't it? Well, in the restaurant, just to continue on the eel, for example, in 2004 we took eel off and replaced it with dogfish, which is a really underutilized species, but it's got the similar dense texture. And in the Japanese context, at least, it's all about the sauce, the kabayaki sauce. So I'd like to think some people didn't notice. Sadly, I don't think that's entirely true, but that's what we did there. In the fishmonger in Soul of Discretion, it's more about, well, I don't know, I'm sure it's not in countries with fantastic food culture. Sadly, UK was not, historically at least, one of them. And we don't like fish with heads on and eyes on and tails and bones and that kind of stuff. So as long as you take a fish, pretty much any white species, and you've filleted it, you've taken out the bones, and you've vacuum packed it into a 300-gram portion of edible protein, most people can't tell the difference between a cod and a whiting in the UK. I'm not proud to say that, but it's true. So if we, as the fishmonger, so we basically pay a fair price to the small-scale fishers. That's the deal. Otherwise, they wouldn't want to land to us. So they are getting a fair price for their fish. So we know our margins in advance. We're not going up and down with the auction. They simply wouldn't land to us. They would land on the auction if it weren't a fair price. So we know we're paying them well. I then take that fish price, fillet it, get the yields, get the edible weight, and just add a straight absolute margin to it, which is so unlike the way most fishmongers work. They work on a moving price with moving margins, a percentage increase. And that means that the cheapest fish, if you've done all the hard work on them, taking the bones out and the head off and all the rest of it, it's still a relatively cheap species for the end person to be eating. And that's what we do. We just make it look like any other piece of fish, and most English people don't mind. They will eat a white fish, whatever it is. I would say that actually it's the lack of access to be able to find these species in the UK that's preventing people from eating them, not the lack of desire.
Very true. Jeanine, you work with hundreds of chefs. What are their biggest struggles when they're trying to move to sustainable sourcing of seafood? And what are you doing to assist them in that?
So in terms of the pain points that we've observed over the number of years that we've worked with the Relais and Châteaux chefs, there's probably a few of them, but I would say that the main one is access to information at the supply level. And we'll talk later about the criteria that we've been working with chefs on to be able to source more sustainably. But chefs often say to us, what is the point of asking these questions that you want us to ask if the suppliers don't actually know the answers? Now, of course, the local context is really important, because in France, for example, it's very heavily regulated, so a lot of the information that you need to know about what you're sourcing is found on labels or invoices. That's probably not the case in places like Southeast Asia, where if you ask the same questions, you may be met with some blank stares. But what we try to explain to the chefs is that these questions around key criteria that we'll develop is not just about actually getting the answer to the question itself. It's really about asking the question to show the value of that information. And there is an issue around transparency. The fact that you're asking these difficult questions is sending a signal that the information is valuable. And by sending the signal that the information is valuable, the idea is to start shifting expectations. And if we shift expectations, then we can hope to potentially change the system. And that issue is not an issue that is only faced by the chefs. It's an issue that is faced at every level of the value chain. It's faced by us as consumers when you go and buy fish at your local market. But again, transparency is so important that having the pressure at every level and asking the relevant questions at every level is what potentially is going to get us to get that transparency in the future.
Thank you. Carolyn, you've obviously had years of experience in this. If there are any chefs in the audience today who are beginning their journey, what should they do if they want to do the right thing with regards to seafood sourcing?
So the sort of easy wins. I mean, we don't work with chefs. We don't work with chefs because they're so blooming hard to work with. So the way you can potentially, the only way I think you can work with small-scale fishermen, so if you make the commitment, I'm only going to work with low-impact fishermen, then you've got to accept that there are days or even weeks when the low-impact fishermen simply can't get to sea because of the weather. I've just come from banlieue, Pickerell. It was 100-kilometre-mile winds there for the entire 5 days I was there. There's no way fishermen, small-scale fishermen, were getting out to sea. So if you're a chef that wants a changing menu with fresh fish locally landed, you've got to accept that there are going to be a lot of periods in the year where the small-scale boats have not been able to get out, particularly maybe in Northern Europe rather than potentially the Southern, but that's not what I experienced in banlieue this week. So the thing that we work with is blast freezing fish. And this is a concept that I have yet to find Michelin-starred chefs embrace. They simply can't do it. And we've had some that have been really committed to the cause, but they simply won't accept that frozen can necessarily be superior to fresh. So that's the number one barrier, I think. In blind tastings, and I've done it quite recently with 2 sustainability workshops, where the vast 11 out of 12 people, some of whom were Michelin-starred chefs, actively preferred the frozen bass and wrasse to the fresh, and they were blind tasting it. So there is that. There's a huge inspiration there. And then the other thing you can do, which so many chefs do now, is they'll have a menu, say a flat fish or an oily fish. It could be any flat fish. It could be any oily fish. Once the place has run out, you move on to the lemon sole. Once the herring has run out, you move on to the mackerel. So you can adapt menus that way.
Thank you. Jeanine, other than eel, is there any other seafood species that are on your own avoid list that you're trying to get action on?
Yeah, so last year, together with the Thick Ocean and their network of worldwide NGOs, we produced a region-specific threatened species list. There's 18 species on there. 4 of them include eel. I won't go through the entire list, but those species were selected because of the state of the wild stocks within the regions and popular consumption in those areas. So we have, for example, just to give an example, in Europe we've got wild Atlantic salmon, and we also have brown crab. But of course those things are linked to particular zones. Perhaps it's worth delving into the criteria that we look at in terms of sourcing sustainably. So over the last 10 years, we've been basically harping on to our chefs that there are 4 key questions that you need to ask suppliers in order to source sustainably. The first one is the scientific name, because often a common name can hide a number of different species. The second one is the precise origin. So I was talking about FAO zones, because one species can come from different bodies of water. So one body of water, in one body of water, it can be at a healthy level, and in another, of course, it can be collapsed. The third question is, what is the fishing and or farming method? Because, of course, we want to ensure that it is responsible both from a social perspective and from an environmental perspective. And the fourth is, what is the maturity size? Because often the legal catch size is inferior, and the maturity size allows you to know whether the fish has had sufficient time to reproduce and repopulate stocks. So over the past 10 years, we've been implementing these questions with chefs, through the validation of special event menus in particular. We've celebrated for many years World Oceans Day. So with Ethic Ocean, we validate these menus. And in fact, what we saw happen over time was that there was a cultural shift within the association, that the chefs were actually submitting species that were more and more responsible. So Ethic Ocean saw this learning in real time, which shows to us that real change on sustainability topics has to be embedded in real decisions and not just delivered as theory. And so today, to capitalize on that progress that we've made with the chefs, we're actually extending an invitation to 100 members to review a full year worth of sourcing in order to be in a position to demonstrate that, of course, sustainability is not a one-off initiative, but a year-round process.
Thank you very much. And final question to Carolyn. Is there one myth about seafood sustainability that you would like to see killed?
One myth. One myth. I mean, to answer the question, then, can we still eat fish? As an NGO, when I came up to looking at it, I mean, if you're going to, industrial, large-scale, reductive capitalist systems don't work with nature. And on that basis, I would be very wary of eating any species of animal based on industrial production. So for me, nature with fish has done absolutely everything for us. It's given that fish a house. We've not had to feed it. It's done everything that it needs to do up until the point of capture. So in fisheries, all you have to get right is that point of capture, which actually makes it so much easier than eating animal protein on the land. So yeah, as an NGO, I want to say don't eat animal protein. As somebody that I know is not going to, I myself eat fish not very often, but occasionally, and as long as it's caught with low impact, I have a relatively sanguine conscience about that.
Thank you very much. And so we've got some time at the end of this panel session for you guys to answer any questions to our panelists. So if you do have any questions, if you could raise your hand, we'll get you, there's a roving mic, 2 roving mics. Just please introduce yourself. So yes, over there.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, panelists. Adrian Vincent. I work with the EU for Algae program of the European Commission, and I have a question for Jeanine. So on top of all the amazing work you do on removing species from the menus of chefs, do you also encourage the use of new ingredients? And typically I'm thinking about seaweed, and with the chef Cola Greco, I think you have a great ambassador. So is it something that you are pushing and encouraging as well?
Thanks for the question. The answer is yes. The part of the recommendations that we make, and again, I think this has already been said, is less and better. So we need to reduce the overall consumption, and then we also need to be ensuring that when we are using fish, well, we're using either sustainable fish, so by looking at the 4 key criteria that we've just discussed, using that information to check sustainability ratings. So Ethic Ocean, for example, has an app that allows you to check sustainability ratings called Guide des Espèces. And then, of course, we tell chefs to be creative. So to use their creative power, because often restriction leads to creativity. So there are really interesting alternatives like seaweed you mentioned, but also, for example, invasive species. So yes, we're exploring all of those avenues.
Thank you. Yes, I think we have a question over here.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. My name is Dukbe Kila Kafidipe. I come from Lagos, Nigeria. I am the founder of Platinum Fisheries, where we determine to ethically and sustainably source seafood at scale. Nigeria has 230 million people according to the records, we suspect about 50 million more. And we do have to source for protein. My determination is to do so ethically, provide a template for fishermen who are still fishing in the wild. But I'm actually passionate about creating a space for fisheries that is ethically sourced, because we do not swing into the forest to get bananas and grains. We cultivate them. I think the task ahead of us for a country as large as mine and for the rest of Africa is to also see how we can create a space for sustainably seafood farming. I hear you when you say that the nature has provided all of the means, but really we've devastated fragile water bodies, not just with fishing, but with developments like housing, and we've eroded natural resources. We need to conserve, we need to preserve, and we need to restore back to nature what is nature's. We're dragging extinct species going into extinction currently. I don't know if there is a space to allow for careful sourcing from nature and also resting nature really and source for our food with responsibility. That's where I stand, and I hope maybe we can speak later to talk more about how we can do this safely for the environment and our people.
Any thoughts on that?
Just very briefly, I mean, marine protected areas are something that I think 30 by 30 is the goal, isn't it? 30% of all the sea will be marine protected by 2030. We're a long way off, and a lot of paper parks and all that kind of thing. But the second thing is I share your I'm going to say anger. You weren't angry, but following on from systemic, that we are taking mostly African fisheries to feed farm salmon, and it is an absolute, it's totally immoral. It shouldn't be happening. So that's got to be the number one point where we have to stop.
Right, we have time for one very quick question, if there is one. Yes, and it has to be extremely quick.
Hi, my name is Karen Kimkana Hendricks. I'm over here, sorry. A really quick question. I'm currently doing an executive MBA with edX Business School in Paris. And my question is, you mentioned Michelin chefs and their position on blast frozen fish and so on. Does Michelin itself take a position on this? Do they have a stand on sustainability of the ingredients used?
Honestly, I don't want to speak for Michelin. I'm not really aware of that, other than the fact that I can tell you that they now have a green Michelin star award, but what is behind that is relatively unclear, at least to me. So I'm not entirely sure whether that's part of the criteria.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of our panel session. Please join me in a big round of applause for our fantastic panelists.